Okay, welcome to the Energy Symposium this evening. Just as a note on who's going to be here next week. So we'll have Brett Hauser as the CEO of Green Lots and a co-founder of Open Charge Alliance. So if you want to know about electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, that's the talk you want. He's the man for that. As a part of the companies that are some of the largest company for EV, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Today we have Dana Harmon of Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, a non-profit organization based here in Texas, which is dedicated to studying the effects of energy poverty, which we will get the definition of from Dana as we go. So this is an important issue, part of the discussions about wage inequality and the role of energy in this, because energy is important, or access to enough energy is important to have a decent lifestyle and a good basic measure of well-being. So I will let Dana take it away from there. Also note that UT and TEPRI are in partnership with a grant from the State Energy Conservation Office to help facilitate learning and education about these issues so we can improve our knowledge about the role of energy and the economy and low incomes in particular. So thank you for coming, Dana.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. It's a pleasure. Is this too loud? It sounds kind of loud to me. Okay, you're good. Little. Okay, great. Firstly, I'll say thank you for being here. As I was on my drive to campus, the sun finally was shining, and I was shocked that anyone actually made it indoors again, because after the weather that we've had. So thank you for being here. First, I'd like to get a little bit of a feel for who's in the audience, which might be helpful to kind of tailor some of my comments. So how many engineers do we have in the room? Whoa, majority. Okay, cool. Policy folks? Okay, social scientists? Economists? All right, cool, great. Well, thank you all for coming. So we've got a good mix, and I think that's great. I really commend some of the work that the Energy Institute does in bringing together kind of a multidisciplinary approach to energy, and I think that translates into a lot of the work that we do as well. As Carrie mentioned, I'm Dana Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. We are a collaboration of power market participants, so utilities, both regulated and deregulated, as well as social service agencies, housing providers, funders to some extent, and other researchers and others that are interested in how to alleviate the energy burdens faced by low-income communities here in Texas. So when I say energy poverty, I think it's important to kind of define the term that we're talking about. When you use those two words together, energy poverty, a lot of people immediately think of third world countries. And there are very, very real lack of energy access issues going on in many parts of the world. Here in Texas, where our research is focused, really we're talking less about access and more about energy affordability and the burden that energy can place on low-income families. So there are actually kind of conflicting definitions in the literature. So we take kind of a broad approach and basically say that it's a condition where the personal cost of energy that's required to maintain a healthy and productive lifestyle creates an unnecessary economic burden. This is also sometimes referred to as energy insecurity, or in the literature sometimes you'll hear about energy democracy as well. So here in Texas, I thought it was useful to kind of talk about who are we talking about, who's really affected by energy poverty. In Texas, 1 in 3, or actually over 1 in 3, it's 37% of the population is considered low income. By that definition, what we're talking about is being below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, which is the level at which many low-income programs are based. Some programs are at 125%. Some other programs use multipliers of an area median income. But here we're talking about 37%. We know that Latino and African American households tend to have higher energy burdens. That's proven itself in the data. And also that households with children and elderly members are at greater risk. Greater risk, number one, because they tend to have generally larger household sizes and so consuming more energy, but then also because the negative effects can be more substantial for children and elderly members of our communities. We also know that renters and homeowners are differently burdened. And the main reason that we thought that was worth pointing out was because the ability to invest in, for example, energy efficiency improvements is different for renters than it is for owners. So I've used the term energy burden a couple of times, which is a term that may not be quite so familiar to everyone. But basically what we're talking about is the total utility spending. And so by that we mean spending on energy, on electricity, as well as gas and other heating fuels over the total gross household income. Now, a lot of the work that our organization has done so far has really been on the numerator. So we're looking at opportunities for bill assistance, which means either rate discounts or help with paying utility bills, with energy efficiency, behavioral modification or conservation practices, as well as opportunities to move from consumers to prosumers or producing a distributed generation through things like solar. We are starting to get into the denominator of this equation. So, when we talk about energy poverty and you look at this equation, you can affect both sides. And we're really starting to look at opportunities for job creation for low-income communities through the current energy transition, which includes workforce development. And then also there's an important aspect of financial training and financial literacy that's a component of this entire picture. These graphs come to us courtesy of our friends at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. And here we're looking specifically at energy burden in Texas cities. And at the bottom here, you'll see the low-income population is denoted in gray. The minority, Latino, and African American communities are in orange and green respectively. And then multifamily is there in blue. The data is shown here for Texas cities largely because it's readily available, it's more easily accessible. This does not by any means, is not intended to indicate a lack of importance in our rural communities in terms of energy burdens. In fact, some of the preliminary data shows that energy burdens are often higher in rural communities, but really this is just a result of the data that's there. This red line that you'll see is the median for all cities, and then the orange is the city median. And really the kind of key takeaway for the slides is for low-income households, they're paying a significantly higher portion of their income going towards home energy costs. As you can imagine, as you get more severe poverty levels, that percentage goes higher. Some families are paying, 12, 15, 20, even 30% of their incomes towards energy. The consequences of the high energy burdens can be quite severe. In fact, I was actually having a conversation last week. I had coffee with the CEO of United Way of Austin. And one of the things that they said was that usually for the past 5 years, the calls that they get are usually about helping to pay the rent or the mortgage, and number 2 or number 3 is almost always utility bills. And what they found and what the data shows is people are having to make decisions on do I keep my lights on, or do I put food on the table for my family, or do I buy medicine or clothes for my kids? So people are having to make trade-offs for kind of what we think of as basic necessities in order to try to pay these high utility bills. And the consequences are very real. So social consequences like residential instability and family disruption. There are several stories where utility shutoffs are one of the main reasons for calls to Child Protective Services. Shutoffs in utilities can often lead to eviction for many households. And then there are also health consequences. So chronic stress and anxiety associated with paying utility bills, as well as negative effects when families turn to alternative heating sources that can cause asthma and other health conditions. And then, of course, there are environmental consequences as well. Thankfully, in my opinion at least, this topic is starting to get more and more media attention. In fact, just this week, on the 22nd, there was an article in the Houston Chronicle that was kind of highlighting the fact that low-income families have fewer resources now, fewer places to turn now for help with utility bills than they have in the past. A lot of what that was highlighting included many things, but one of which was the fact that the System Benefit Fund has been discontinued, and so there was a Texas program called Light Up Texas that would help with rate discounts for low-income families that's no longer available. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But it is starting to, this topic is starting to gain a little bit of momentum, and you know, a couple of years ago when we started this work, it was sort of like we were having a little bit of trouble finding comrades in this space and people who really understood the issue, and what we're finding now is that people are starting to pay attention, and for that I'm quite grateful. And I think academia is starting to pay attention too. I thought this was a really interesting graph, and I apologize because I see now that I blew up the wrong version of it clearly. But this graph came from a study that we did a couple of years ago, which was a landscape of energy poverty. Basically, we wanted to figure out what was known in the U.S. about energy poverty and its effects. And with that, we compiled about 600, it was a giant literature review. We compiled about 600 different articles about energy poverty across the country. And what we saw was this really interesting trend that since 2010, the focus on this subject is starting to take off. I was talking recently with a professor at the University of Michigan who runs the Urban Energy Justice Research Institute up there, and one of the things that he said that I thought was really interesting was that he felt like he had a place where he can make a career. He felt like there was a lot of work to be done in this space, and he thought it was a place worth investing his time and resources. So for any of you who are deciding what you'd like to do after you get out of UT, I think this is a very interesting and worthwhile subject, and one that we need a lot more focus and research done on. So next I'd like to talk a little bit about really the drivers of energy burdens, or why are low-income households facing high energy burdens. There's a quote that I use, or that I refer to mentally many times, because you know, when you start talking about poverty in low-income households and the variety of challenges that a low-income family faces on a daily basis, it can get a little bit overwhelming, because you start looking at energy, and then you start looking at housing and all the reasons for housing complications, and you look at education and kind of the drivers there. But this framework, I think, has been very helpful, at least for me, in thinking about, okay, what levers do we have at our disposal to try to start to affect energy burdens here in Texas? And so really, I thought that this is another, some more work done from ACEEE, but I thought they did a great job of kind of breaking it down into physical barriers, which have to do with a home, the structure itself, as well as the appliances in that household, which has to do with housing age, housing type, single versus multifamily, the HVAC system, weatherization that has or has not been done, the type of appliances, et cetera. Then there are economic barriers, and so this is getting largely to kind of that denominator that I was referring to earlier, but recognizing that there are a variety of economic situations that lead to people not being able to keep up with their energy bills. In some cases, it's chronic low income, so persistent over time. In some cases, there's a sudden loss of income or sudden unexpected family circumstances that put a family in a very difficult situation. And I think these are important to understand, because the more we understand about those circumstances, the better we can design products and services that meet the needs of those families. Another big, important factor here on the economic side is credit. An ability to qualify for financing for the types of upgrades that may be helpful for low-income families, whether that's energy efficiency related to solar panels on the roof, et cetera. And there, the more creative we can get with innovative financing models that, aren't necessarily subsidies or solely subsidies for low-income households, but if we can put together products that are more accessible to low-income households, we may be able to solve some of those challenges. There's another category of behavioral drivers, and this one is a big challenge as well. I'll talk a little bit later about kind of the TEPRI network and who all is involved, but I mentioned that we have many utilities, whether it's utilities, retail electric providers, co-ops, municipal utilities, et cetera. And many of them say that one of their biggest challenges is consumer engagement. It's outreach and education. It's how do you connect with these households? There's kind of a euphemism in the industry about it's hard to reach and costly to serve, right, for the low-income community. And the hard to reach is very true. And so there's an opportunity there. If we can help utilities better connect with this population, then they may be able to better serve those communities. There's also a financial benefit for the utilities to doing so too in terms of the cost of service to those customers. But back to the behavioral side, so a lack of, just in terms of energy literacy, of knowledge about conservation practices, about programs that are available to help, is another key driver of high energy burdens. And then finally on the policy side, so insufficient or inaccessible programs or policies that really help promote better service to low-income households can be a driver. And then there's a lot going on, of course, in the industry now in terms of different rate designs with time of use pricing, with other fixed charges and things like that can make it a challenge, can make it difficult for low-income households to be in control of their utility costs. So I don't know if you all agree with the title on this slide, but I know it's a common saying, as Texas goes, so goes the nation. And I think this is really interesting and useful. I talk with people all over the country about the work that we're doing here in Texas, and it does, we think we're different, we're unique, we know that. But in many ways, we do believe that we have, if we can find solutions that work here, there's a very good chance that we've got the opportunity to scale in a meaningful way across the country. What these graphs show, so here in the green is the total population by county. So really that's just showing that we've got a very diverse mix of very large, dense urban areas and then vast rural areas as well. This graph is showing the poverty density by county, and a lot of what you'll see there is we do have certainly large pockets of poverty concentrated along the border, but then also mixed throughout our cities as well. This graph is actually showing, it's the transmission and distribution utilities in Texas competitive electric areas. And really what this is meant to show is sort of the complexity of the market here in Texas, and showing that we need to find models that work for the transmission and distribution utilities, that work for the retailers, that work for the munis, that work for the co-ops, and those aren't necessarily all the same. So we believe that we need to be mindful of the drivers of the business practices of those that are providing electricity or energy services to low-income households, so that we may develop solutions that better fit those models. And then finally, I think this is an important graph to show as well. We talked about the fact that high energy burdens affect minorities disproportionately, and specifically Hispanics. The state demographer is predicting that from 2010 to 2050, that the Hispanic population in Texas is expected to double. So we expect that this is a problem that isn't going to go away, and we have an opportunity now to get in front of it and to start to develop some meaningful solutions as our population continues to grow. The other point that I'd like to make kind of with this concept, and it's one of the things that we're working on, and actually part of the CECO project that Carrie mentioned earlier, this is kind of an evolution of where we're headed. But if you can imagine, kind of overlaying those data sets, those separate maps of Texas, along with consumption information and along with cultural preferences and community needs assessments information, we believe that we can start to create almost fingerprints of different communities across the state based on their needs. And that's not to downplay the uniqueness of any individual community, but really what we're hopeful that we can find is if we can develop solutions that work for one group of communities, then we may have the opportunity to scale to others. This is also the reason that we think it's really important to create a network of stakeholders across the state, both, again, on the energy sector side as well as the social services side and the housing side. And if we can create that network and start to spread best practices for solutions that are working in program design and energy efficiency technologies, in the innovative financial products that I was talking about, that we believe that we have the opportunity to really we have channels through which we may be able to scale some of the solutions that start to relieve energy burdens. So this is a map that I've created a while ago as I was really trying to wrap my head around all of the different factors that are affecting energy poverty. We are in a very dynamic period in the electricity sector right now, and the energy sector in general. And then it's also a very dynamic period in the social sector. So one of the things that we wanted to try to do here is start to figure out, okay, what are the drivers in this map, and how do we make sure that we're touching each of the components? So let me try to explain this. And I'll also mention that this is kind of evolving over time as our thinking is evolving. But basically, here to this side, you've got kind of the energy side, the power sector. Over here, you've got kind of the social services sector, the quality of life. And really what we're seeing is, as we were talking about those drivers of energy poverty, that inner circle is really kind of more first order factors, so things that we can start to affect that we believe can start to have an effect on energy poverty. The map on the outside is really more kind of second order factors that are really kind of affecting that middle ground. We believe that if we can take almost a systems approach with this model and start to understand how the relationships between one of those factors and the other, that we may be able to have a greater impact and start to really find some leverage in the solutions that we're coming up with. Okay, next I'll talk a little bit about funding. This is a lot of words, I realize, as I see it up there on the slide. I apologize for that. But there are a couple of sources of funding available for low-income households. So the LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, is funded through Congress, through HHS. And the program has been around for quite a while, but really it's intended to help people pay utility bills. The majority of this funding goes for heating and cooling assistance or crisis assistance, with some small portion going towards weatherization as well. In 2018, Texas received $152 million through the federal Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. That funding flows through the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, or TDHCA, and actually flows to 39 community action partnership agencies across the state. In some cases, these are counties or councils of governments or standalone community action agencies. They administer other programs often as well, either Head Start programs or medical programs, but the LIHEAP program is often one of the things that they do. But those 39 agencies cover all 254 counties in the state of Texas. Additionally, there's the Weatherization Assistance Program. This one goes through DOE, and it's a much smaller bucket of money, but it's intended for weatherization and energy efficiency upgrades for low-income houses across the state. So both of those, the LIHEAP funding and the Weatherization Assistance Program funding, both flow through TDHCA, through the state, through a program called CAP, there's a lot of acronyms, but it's the Comprehensive Energy Assistance Program. And together they serve the needs through those agencies that I just mentioned. I think this slide is really telling because while there is a pot of money there available, we're only meeting about 4% of those eligible for to be served in the state of Texas. And so really the key message here, I think, is that the federal funding isn't enough. As I mentioned earlier, the state funding has been decommissioned for the Light Up Texas program through the System Benefit Fund. So we've got to figure out how to come up with other solutions that can help sustainably better serve the needs of low-income Texans. This is a show of the funding that is coming through. As I mentioned earlier, most of the 75% of that funding is going to help people pay their utility bills, which has a very important and meaningful role in terms of serving the needs of low-income people. But we need to figure out how to shift more, to pair that with more sustainable solutions in the long term so that we can decrease the need for that funding over time. Okay, so that's a lot about kind of the problem. Now, who are we and what do we do? So TEPRI, the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, really our mission is to inspire lasting energy solutions for low-income communities. And that takes on a lot of different flavors. At first when I came on board with the organization, our goal, our main audience was industry. It was really I'll say specifically electricity, really utilities at that time. And we wanted to be able to provide actionable data that could help them make better decisions. I think over time, what we've realized is that view is much too narrow, and that we need to open the conversation to include housing providers, to include the social service agencies that I mentioned, to include funders, because many times these industries are operating in kind of siloed ways and not really talking to each other. We actually hosted a conference this past spring in Galveston, which was kind of an energy poverty and affordable housing conference. And it was super interesting because we had, there was a track that was focused on all sorts of affordable housing issues that had nothing to do with energy. There was an energy program track that didn't necessarily affect the housing side. It was more kind of the utility assistance. And then there was a track where we came together and we were talking about energy efficiency and weatherization and how to incentivize investments, and especially for low-income housing and the renter situation. The term there's an issue called the split incentive issue, where a landlord is responsible for paying for investments to a property to include energy efficiency investments, where the benefit goes to the tenant. And so the landlord isn't necessarily incentivized to make that investment because he sees no financial return. And it's a well-studied, well-known issue, but one that we don't really have a good solution to yet. And so, that was one of the things that we were talking about at the conference, was how do we start to break down some of those barriers. And so we got 200 people together in Galveston for, a day and a half conference. We were super excited about it. We thought we were going to have all these working groups and make great progress and, solve the world's problems. And really the biggest takeaway from that meeting was that we were doing this. Like, the energy people didn't know how to talk to the housing people. Like, it was completely different language. Just even the basic terminology, we had a lot of education to do. The good thing is, from that meeting, there was some momentum that built, and there are working groups that have started because of it, and we're setting priorities and objectives for what we want to do in terms of reducing energy burdens. But we've got a long way to go in just getting people to talk to each other and recognizing the needs that are being faced by our communities here in Texas. So, at first, as I mentioned, I thought we were a research institute, for the electricity sector. Now I'm realizing that there's an opportunity for us really as a convener in saying, hey, you guys all talk to each other. There's a lot of smart people working on this stuff, but we're not talking. And so there's kind of a role for us there. And then finally, I think there's really a role to play. We mentioned earlier about the consumer engagement and outreach and education. And so there's a role for us to play in helping connect with communities through community-based organization, those entities that are already there, either the faith-based organizations or the community organizations. You may have heard of kind of this grass tops effort concept where you hear of grassroots, grassroots organizations coming from the bottom up, but the grass tops is if we can find ways to connect with community leaders, then there are impact channels that can be made in terms of distribution through communities. And so we're doing some work there. But really, I guess all of this is to say we kind of started out as a research institute, and we're kind of expanding to this broader set of deliverables or offerings, I guess, but really the whole reason for that is we think this is what's going to ultimately drive the change that can reduce energy burdens for low-income households. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes as well. Here are just kind of some of our target impact areas, and this is really kind of let's call it a 3-year view of the work that we're doing. But really how, there's a lot of talk now about distributed energy resources, and most of which are out of reach oftentimes for low-income households. And there I'm talking about rooftop solar, but also community solar, as well as storage, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, demand response, I think all kind of fall into this bucket. And so really understanding how do we use this advancement in the sector to help reduce energy burdens. Reducing barriers to outreach and education, I talked about. Energy efficiency, addressing access to capital and credit. I hate to sound like a broken record, but that really, it's a major hurdle in this space, and if we can figure out how to address some of those barriers, a whole market opens up, which is really part of what we'd like to be doing. Pairing crisis assistance with the solutions that address the root causes. Some people may say that this is kind of the whole hand up, not hand out concept, but really, there will always be a need for crisis assistance and utility assistance, but how do we make sure that we are using those funds as efficiently as possible so that they have the greatest impact on the greatest number of people. And then finally, leveraging the programs that are out there. Because, as I was talking about the siloed conversations, the programs are all siloed, right? So the housing folks programs don't integrate with the utility programs, which oftentimes don't even actually integrate with the state programs. So there's a lot of opportunity we feel to better leverage those dollars, and in some cases to actually use philanthropic dollars to kind of put some of that together to create a machine almost that can start to make a better impact. Okay, so here I think this is really important as well, and this is, I guess, maybe going back a little bit to the lessons learned concept. But as I mentioned, at first we were thinking energy. I remember when I started this work. Actually, it was somebody that's now at the ATI that told me how fortunate I was to be in this very niche area where I'm focused on energy and poverty. It's very specific. And what I think I very quickly realized is it's a very complicated picture. And in order to understand how we can reduce energy burdens, we very much have to understand the relationships between energy and housing, energy and health, energy and education, and energy and economic opportunity. And we believe that there's a lot of education to be done in the energy sector about the role that this group can play in terms of promoting the path to self-sufficiency for low-income households. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with this kind of logic model or theory of change model. But here it's basically saying, okay, we're doing this research. How is that research ultimately going to impact something that matters to households? Because really, as a research institute, we have no control over the policies. We don't control the programs. We can't force utilities to make decisions differently. But really what we believe we can do is through research, and I've actually kind of expanded this to research, development, and demonstration projects, which mean on-the-ground projects in communities across the state, through kind of demonstrating paths that work, through convening partners, stakeholders, the industry, and outreach and education. we believe that we can achieve this suite of outcomes, which vary. Both, it's industry outcomes, it's consumer outcomes, it's product development outcomes, but kind of a suite of outcomes that ultimately have the ultimate impact of increased clean energy access and penetration and reduced energy burdens in low-income communities in the state. Here, I think I've talked probably enough about this, but this is basically the work that we do. I do want to talk a little bit about the decision tools, actually, because I haven't focused on this one too much yet. So we are, we're collecting a lot of data. There's data available from multiple sources, from American Community Survey data, there's residential energy consumption survey data, there's needs assessment data that's from the CAP agencies, and oftentimes this data is living in different places. And we believe that there's an opportunity to create software tools that make better use of those data sources that can help either a utility or a social service agency look specifically at their service territory and understand what the needs of that community are. So part of what we're working on with this, the Clearinghouse project that I'll talk about here in a moment, is really how do we create tools that help the stakeholder network interact with the data in a meaningful way that can help them make real-time decisions in terms of how they're designing their programs so that they have better efficient use of their resources. So I think that is a kind of critical component to the work that we have evolving that honestly wasn't our plan a couple of years ago, but it's kind of based on the need that we've seen out there. Okay, so here, this is really kind of looking at, I guess this is really graphic to talk about the opportunity to leverage those disparate programs that I was talking about earlier. We really do believe, there's kind of a lot of low-hanging fruit here. Really a lot of it is people haven't been focusing on this space. But we believe that there's a kind of a high leverage strategy where if we can align ourselves on the objectives, whether that's percentage energy burden reduction, whether that's percent kilowatt hour reduction, whether that's peak shifting, if we can align ourselves on the objectives, we believe that we can align federal programs, utility programs, community approaches, affordable housing, financing policy, and then looking at the opportunity for kind of all of the above in terms of where we're focusing those resources to achieve this, kind of, I don't know, the trifecta almost, right, of social equity, economic opportunity, and environmental protection. I was reading a paper the other day where someone actually proposed that that's not possible, kind of the idea that this doesn't exist, that you can't have social equity and environmental protection and economic opportunity all coexist at the same time. However, I would beg to differ on that, and I think that's where we're headed. Here's an example of one of the tools that I mentioned, and this is really just a prototype at this point, but it's kind of gotten a lot of traction. So it's really it's a visualization of a lot of data that already exists, but in a frame that a lot of people haven't seen it before. So here what we're doing is taking the electricity burden data that comes from the residential energy consumption survey data, which utilities have a lot more granular access than is available in that survey, but this is kind of a demonstration of the concept. But take electricity burden data with poverty data by census tract and overlay, and this one we were looking at high-risk groups specifically, so if we can overlay households with disability in the presence of young children, and here actually the median year housing build was a proxy for energy and efficiency investments in the home. Then this happens to be Harris County, by the way, and if Harris County is the Houston area. If we can overlay those data sets, then we can start to identify what is potentially higher risk block groups within a given service territory. This was specifically where we were putting this together for CenterPoint Energy, who's the transmission and distribution utility who serves Harris County. Then they can start to use that information to better target their efforts for their low-income energy efficiency programs, which would be potentially a better use of resources. And what we'd like to be able to do is really make that concept available across the state of Texas, and in theory even more widely so, so that we can really start to identify where needs are. Additionally, in addition to these kind of publicly available data sets, we are starting to collect needs assessment data, which I'll talk about here in a moment, but we would really like to conduct a longitudinal study so that we can see how needs of communities are changing over time from an energy burden perspective, that we could then feed into this tool as well. And this is kind of the vision of where we'd like to go for some of the work that Carrie mentioned earlier, which I'll talk about here in a moment. So this is our energy poverty landscape analysis. This is a paper that we published in the summer of 2017. This is what that collection of 600 resources that I'd mentioned that we pulled together and that created that graph. But really, this was kind of an idea to say, okay, do we have a handle on what's out there? You're welcome to go download the paper from our website if you'd like, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Really, the key findings from that research study was that there's, number one size does not fit all when it comes to low-income program design. So programs really need to be tailored to the individual needs of the community, based on the housing stock, based on the cultural preferences, based on the demographic data. And so it's very important to tailor programs based on that data. Improving engagement, which is kind of, again, the holy grail, but there's a huge opportunity to improve engagement within the community. And if you can figure out how to unlock that, there's a lot of opportunity from an outreach and education perspective. Include other benefits. This isn't one that I've talked about too much, but most of the models that are used to determine which measures are most effective for a household, they're all financial models, right? And so you're looking at a savings to investment ratio in terms of an energy efficiency opportunity. Really, we'd like to look at the benefits of, or look at opportunities to incorporate non-energy benefits. It's kind of how it's referred to in the literature, but basically, what are the health impacts that we might be able to monetize over time, and what does that look like? How do you bring that into your model? What about asset building in the community? What about in terms of education, educational opportunities for the community? If we can kind of take broaden our perspective a little bit in terms of how we develop the models, we think there are opportunities there. And then finally, pursue advanced metering infrastructure services. So right now we have a ton of data available, electricity consumption available based on our smart meters that most of us have in this state that really we're not using for much right now. And there's, I think, vast opportunity to better design, not just rate design, but other products, electricity products and services that could better match the needs of low-income households based on the data that we're getting in 15-minute intervals from meters across the state. So that was another key finding from that study. Okay. Here is the Energy Poverty Clearinghouse, and this is the effort that Carrie mentioned at the onset, which we're delighted to be collaborating with the Energy Institute and the State Energy Conservation Office on. But really, I wish I could give you a demonstration of what the clearinghouse would be, but I promise there will be something available soon. We have a graduate research assistant who's plugging away at it diligently. But really, the idea is we need a place where all of these resources, a repository to educate stakeholders, whether it's policymakers, whether it's a utility program manager, whether it's a customer service agent, a social services provider, a affordable housing provider, one place that folks can go to get educated on the drivers of energy poverty and what that means, and to learn best practices and what's working throughout the state and throughout the country. Just an example of that, actually, we are conducting some work now for a municipal utility here in Texas, looking at a low-income community solar program design. So it's a really cool project. It's about a 5 megawatt project, about 20% of which will be dedicated towards low-income households. And one of the things that we were asked to do was to provide kind of best practices for what's going on across the country in terms of community solar, and specifically low-income community solar. And interestingly, there's not one place that you can go to find that stuff now. So we're conducting a whole bunch of interviews, and we're reaching out to a whole lot of people across the country. But that data will all be available through this clearinghouse. The clearinghouse I also expect to expand to include some of that GIS, the mapping capability that we showed earlier. So it originally was intended to be just a document repository or repository for white papers. Now we see it as an opportunity to build a GIS tool and a data repository as well. This is just kind of an example of how we've structured the clearinghouse data so far. This was really the structure that we used to write the Energy Poverty Landscape Analysis white paper. We've kind of tried to categorize all of the resources and the topics. We've gone in and tagged and coded all of that data. But based on kind of these main areas of energy burdens, technologies that are available, programs, program design, rates, policy, behavior, and fuel types, basically. And what we're finding is actually this is changing over time, but what this is meant to show is, at least at the time that we wrote the paper, the topics in red are what there's kind of a lot of research done on. That's what we know a lot about. And then the topics in the dark blue, there's not a whole lot out there. And so we're attempting to build this as we start to see the body, the corpus of knowledge grow over time. We'd like this to be a structure that can be updated so that we can continue to educate stakeholders on the latest and greatest of what's out there in terms of addressing energy poverty. Another UT-related project, actually. So we worked with the LBJ school the last, I guess, academic year with a policy research project that was creating an energy burden profile study. And here, this is kind of the beginnings of that needs assessment that I mentioned. For this program, we were looking at, let me see, 5 different energy burden indicators across the state of Texas. So looking at housing, financial hardships, sociodemographic profiles, household makeup, and health to try to understand how those energy burden indicators vary across the country on top of what we could find from publicly available data sets. Let's see, I'm supposed to say 15 minutes, aren't I? So I'm not going to go into too much on this. Okay. I'll blow through this, but basically, so we divided the state of Texas up into 11 different regions, and we collected data, statistically representative samples through surveys as well as in-depth quantitative interviews on each of those 5 different energy burden indicators. I was very hopeful that I'd be able to present the results of that study at this talk, although it's not quite available yet, but it should be coming here before the end of the year, so please stay tuned and maybe follow us. Follow TEPRI, and you'll be able to see the results of that study. This one I wanted to throw in. This is a report that was released by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory earlier this year, in April of this year. And specifically, I wanted to call this out as we're talking about the potential. This is actually less about reducing energy burdens, but talking about the technical and economic potential for rooftop solar on low-income housing across the country, which is really quite phenomenal. And so if we can find ways to capture this potential for rooftop solar, we believe that has a real potential we can use that potential to reduce energy burdens in low-income households across the state. So this is very preliminary stuff, but we think there's a lot there. I try to take off the animations. But really the kind of the key here that I'd like to share is there's a lot more work to do in this space, for sure. Just in terms of energy, of conservation and behavioral impacts, the effects of different real-time usage data that's needed, demographic data, et cetera. There's a lot that's left unexplored in this space. We'd like to be able to start to try to make a dent in some of that, but to the extent that any of you are looking at what you're going to study for any upcoming projects, we think there's a lot of work to be done here. And frankly, we're really just getting started in terms of what we know about how to reduce energy burdens for low-income households. Oh, real quickly, so I've talked a lot about our network so far, but this is just kind of an example of who they are. So I won't go through the list. It's on our website if you'd like to see it. But I actually would like to mention that we're talking with national labs and universities across the country as well. So there are people that are starting to work on this stuff. And so we're trying to make sure to stay engaged and that we can learn from the best practices of all that's out there. This is our board of directors. Obligatory slide to say thank you to them. And shout out to our founder, Becky Klein. Becky is a former Public Utility Commission of Texas chairman who founded the organization a couple of years ago and brought me on board to kind of stand this up. And so it's a really great and diverse board that we've got that kind of leads these efforts. So in conclusion, high energy burdens do affect quality of life of people in the state. There's an opportunity for high leverage strategies we believe that can really start to improve quality of life by reducing energy burdens and by taking a thoughtful approach of the system that's affecting energy poverty. We believe that we can start to make meaningful change. And then I love this quote, so I just had to put it up there. But I know we've got a variety of perspectives in the room, but do your little bit of good where you are. It's those bits put together that overwhelm the world, which I think is really, really meaningful. That's all. Thank you very much.
All right, raise your hand if you have a question. We'll come around. I'll start a question. Keishan, go ahead. I'll start with one question. What do we know about how much this has changed over time? Is the energy burden a worse problem now in Texas or let's just stick with the United States or Texas now versus 1960 or 1980? We know general discussions about inequality and wages have been going down since the 70s, but would this just not even be a problem at all if we knew what we knew today in 1960, or do we even know to ask that question?
That's an excellent question. And I guess the short answer is, I don't know. Just in terms of what energy burdens have looked like historically. I will say that it's something that we weren't, to your point, we weren't studying in 1960. So we could get the data to go back and look at utility bills, but we haven't done the research. But I will say that there's, we have made tremendous strides in terms of energy efficiency, but then also consumption has increased significantly. So it would be really interesting to find out.
What sort of work have y'all done with or relationship do y'all have with the Pecan Street Project and the work they're doing?
Oh yeah, so we are talking regularly with Pecan Street. In fact, we put together a proposal for DOE for the Department of Energy recently related to the Solar Energy Technologies Office funding opportunity announcement that was actually going to be, the proposal was an extension of that community solar project that I mentioned with the municipal utility. Unfortunately, we learned day before yesterday that we did not get selected for that grant. So right now the I guess short answer is we'll see. I think the work that we're going to go next is looking for other grant opportunities to continue that concept.
Then I wanted to ask you, if I think that the problem is poverty, but not necessarily just energy poverty, should we be focusing on looking at the big picture and perhaps providing information rather than addressing specific energy or housing or other issues?
I think it's an excellent question, and one I can tell you that I've struggled with personally as I've gotten into this work, because it's a very valid point. And I heard a quote not too long ago that I think actually came from Scott Tinker at the BEG here, who said, and it was really helpful for me, because the quote was, energy cannot solve poverty, but you cannot solve poverty without energy. And I think that's very meaningful. So I'm not under the delusion that the work that we're doing is going to solve poverty, because it's as I mentioned, complex and multi-dimensional phenomenon, from housing to workforce development to structural inequities to, this very complex system. But I think there is this opportunity for us in the energy sphere to say we have an important role to play, and let's do our part to make sure we do that.
Maybe I'll follow up to that question. So you showed some of these sort of holistic set of systems thinking to understand the role of energy and these broader issues of health and education and all these kinds of things that might affect poverty. And you pointed out so many different implications there that I started making me think, if I were sort of a real activist promoting low-income families in this, I might look at this and I think you're sort of avoiding solutions by death by 1,000 cuts. You put up like 50 things to think about, and you've sent a bunch of ants running around thinking about 50 points, and the point is that we don't pay people enough money to work, or something just simple. And the tax code has been changed to benefit the rich more than the poor. And why don't you just say that? Why do you go through all these other ideas? Why don't you just say that? Why don't we just say, let's just redistribute money so that the energy burden only is 4% for every single person in Texas, and we redistribute taxes that way. And if you don't like that, then you got to find another solution.
That's one approach. And an important one, I think. But really, I think there's kind of the long-term thinking and the short-term thinking, right? And some of what we're talking about is somewhere in between. But I think there's a very real message for me that kind of keeps me going with this work that, for most of us in this room, saving $15, $20 on your utility bill in a month may not be that big of a deal, but for some families, that's a huge percentage, and it may make the difference in whether they can buy groceries one of those weeks, right? And so if we have the opportunity to reduce that energy burden, to make resources available for families, I think it's worthwhile to do so. I also think from an efficiency of energy, efficiency of resources perspective, we know that there's a lot of waste in this system, right? We know that these programs are inefficient. We know that they're not meeting the need. We know that the data is not being utilized correctly. So I think just in terms of helping better the system so that it can be more efficient and help more people, there's real opportunity there. That's not to say that we don't need to pay people more. That's a very real component of it. I mentioned in that numerator-denominator conversation earlier, we'd done most of our work on the numerator, right? That's where we were working, and we weren't really looking at the income space. And then we start looking at workforce development and jobs and how do you help increase people's income. And then it's kind of like, well, gosh, are we just talking about in the energy sector, or are we looking at jobs more generally, and where does that go? So right now, I think the kind of the short answer is we're looking at things that we think can affect immediate change, but we are under no impression that that's the whole solution.
Thank you, Dana. Excellent talk. I was curious, CPS Energy in San Antonio has taken a rather unique approach to how they incentivize rooftop residential solar that, in my opinion, is much more equitable or approachable to lower income. Do you guys do much work with them, and are you aware of how their program works?
Are you talking about the Solar Host
Yeah.
program? Yeah, so we do. In fact, I put the board slide up there. Maria Garcia, who's a VP of Consumer Engagement, is on our board of directors, and so we do work a lot with CPS. And I know there have been some great successes and some lessons learned with the Solar Host program.
What are some of the lessons learned?
Well, in terms of really being able, just implementation of the program, and being able to, well, actually, there are a couple of things. Number one, at least anecdotally, I've heard from them that the number of applicants for that program was so much greater than the number of home roofs that were actually qualified, for solar. And so there was kind of a marketing component to that discussion in terms of how do you structure it. I do think there's a lot of opportunity with Solar Host. And in fact, with solar generally, I think my opinion on this is that models are certainly evolving, especially for the low income space.
Was there any preference given to low income?
For Solar Host, we weren't, so Teppery wasn't directly involved in it. I don't believe there was.
think they do try to allocate some of the solar programs to low-income areas, just percentage-wise, but I don't recall the exact program as well.
I was wondering if you could talk about how the Texas legislature fits into all of this, in what ways, and if there was any one program that you could like maybe push through this session, what would it be? What would it look like?
In terms of this session, well, maybe not this session, but one of the things that we have talked about a lot is the System Benefit Fund and the Light Up Texas program that I mentioned a couple of times. And really the fact that the reason for the decommissioning of that fund was not because it wasn't helping people. It was largely because of a misallocation, a misappropriation of those funds, right? And so there are conversations about the potential of like an SBF, a System Benefit Fund V2. And, do we really understand what worked and what didn't work with that program? And is there an opportunity to kind of revisit the concepts with improvements that would be more effective? And I think there are a lot of people kind of looking at that because Texas, many other states do have some sort of state funding to help to direct towards this, and so I think there is an opportunity there. That said, though, I should also mention that at TEPRI, as a research organization, we're not advocates. We're certainly not lobbyists. And so really our goal is to be able to provide the information that helps make that argument from a policy perspective. And so, we would not necessarily be advocating for a specific position, but that is the one that I think is, there is opportunity there.
Thank you. Can you speak more to what your partnerships with community groups looks like?
Sure, yeah. So number one, actually, another member of our board is, so we talked a lot about the community action agencies, the 39 agencies across the state. So there's a Texas Association of Community Action Agencies who kind of convenes, really is a bit of a go-between between the agencies and TDHCA and the state. And so we work a lot with that organization, TACA, the Texas Association of Community Action Agencies, to get connected with the agencies across the state. So there's kind of that group that administers the funding. And then also we've started doing work with, for example, in San Antonio, Westside Development Corporation, who's there on the west side, largely low-income area, and offer several services for the community, but trying to get better connected with the community and understanding the needs and the preferences of the community there. We do think that there's a big opportunity. We're talking some more, I guess, with Salvation Army and with United Way and others to say, okay, what really are the needs? The other, I think, is on the housing side and looking at community development organizations across the state, and because they're very connected with communities as well. And so it's taking several different flavors. And the thing is, I think that's another case where one size doesn't fit all, right? So you can't say that this model is going to work across the board. So really it's how do we get connected with community leaders. I will say also that from a capacity standpoint, it's probably not realistic to say that we can't be in 254 counties in the state. So this is where kind of that grass tops effort that I mentioned comes into play. So if we can kind of help build that network, and in some cases leverage the networks that are already existing, right? So the state networks in ways that are meaningful and help start to create that two-way communication channel between community needs and organizations like ours and the utilities and the whole stakeholder group.
All right, one last question.
Yeah. Yeah.
If there were like a simple standard.
Right.
meet their margins just to code.
Right.
So if there was a standardization.
Right, right. So it's interesting. So the conversations that I've been a part of haven't really been around standardizing the leases, but there have been discussions about whether or not the landlord does pay the utility bills, because that is in some cases utility bills are included in the rent payment, right? And so that's not a standard across the board. And it's interesting. I had a developer actually asked me recently which is better, for the tenant to pay the utility bill or for the landlord. And I think in terms of addressing that split incentive issue, there is some benefit there, but then there's also kind of a behavior or conservation piece. I've heard landlords say that if I pay the utility bills, then people have, their AC on and the windows open, right? And so what's that mix that makes the most sense? It's an important conversation, and one that I think there are multiple models out there, because the right answer may not be obvious. But it's a very interesting discussion, and one that I'm hopeful that, I mentioned we have this kind of energy and housing working group, but I think that's a good opportunity to tackle that type of conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Dana. That was a wonderful talk, and thank you, audience, for good questions.
Thank you.